In palaces draped with velvet and gold, the British royals wrote their legacy in portraits and bloodlines. But behind the throne, in shadows no one dared illuminate, were children who didn't fit the script. Hidden in asylums, edited from history, or simply never mentioned again, these sons and daughters bore the quiet burden of disability in a family obsessed with perfection. This is not the story of kings and queens. It's the story of the ones they tried to forget. 30 royals, 30 children. One long silence that still echoes through the crown. Before we dive into the first royal secret, take a second to subscribe. If you're into untold history, buried truths, and the kinds of stories that never made it into the official portraits, you're in the right place. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it as you listen? Midnight? Noon? Somewhere in between? Let's see how far this royal rabbit hole really reaches. 1. Queen Victoria. She was the grandmother of Europe, empress of half the known world. A woman so tightly corseted by duty and dynasty that even her emotions were rationed like wartime sugar. And yet, beneath the starched layers of widow's black and imperial iconography, Queen Victoria carried a secret in her blood, and worse, she passed it on. Her youngest son, Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, was born with hemophilia, a genetic condition that made the simplest injury a potential death sentence. A bruise could become a bloodbath, a stumble, a slow execution. At the time, the British public knew nothing. To them, Victoria's brood was robust, militaristic, almost aggressively fertile. 17 grandchildren would go on to occupy the thrones of Europe. And yet in this most powerful family of the 19th century, there lurked a silent flaw that no throne could protect against. Hemophilia was the royal family's curse, but it wasn't treated that way, not publicly. Because admitting to a weakness, especially a hereditary one, would have meant more than shame. It would have meant political vulnerability. In a world still obsessed with divine right and genetic superiority, the presence of a defective gene wasn't just inconvenient. It was treason against the myth of monarchy. So they hid it, not just the illness, the pain, the constant medical supervision, the unpredictable bleeds, the long absences from public life, and the eventual death of Leopold at age 30 after slipping and hitting his knee. It wasn't the fall that killed him. It was what leaked inside. Victoria was devastated, but not only by grief, by fear. The realization that she had passed this on, unknowingly, but irreversibly. And worse, she had passed it to daughters. In genetic terms, they were carriers. In dynastic terms, they were ticking time bombs. She tried to marry them well, tried to dilute the curse with carefully chosen husbands from across Europe. Instead, she spread it into the Spanish royal family, the Russian imperial line, the German princely houses. Victoria didn't just rule an empire, she infected it. With every wedding veil and state banquet, hemophilia traveled under the radar, masquerading as royal blood. Of course, science didn't have the vocabulary for this yet. The gene responsible, carried on the X chromosome, wouldn't be fully understood until decades later. And yet, somewhere in the obsessive record-keeping and secret medical notes of the royal household, they must have known something was wrong. Too many boys bleeding too easily. Too many deaths that didn't make sense. Too many sudden silences. Victoria herself never publicly acknowledged the condition. But her private letters betray hints. Worry over the delicate constitutions of certain grandchildren, anxiety over the marriages of her daughters, careful euphemisms about constitutional weaknesses. She wrote endlessly, and often cryptically. And the archives still hold volumes that have yet to be fully opened. Some historians have called it the royal disease, a tidy phrase for something quietly monstrous. But the more unsettling question is not how it spread, it's how long it was kept quiet. Not just in Britain, but across Europe. in palaces that valued image over truth, obedience over health, and bloodlines over the bodies that carried them. Because what does it mean when the very thing that defines your right to rule, your lineage, is also the source of your downfall? Leopold wasn't the only one. He passed it to his daughter, who passed it on again. A recursive tragedy dressed in ermine and honorifics. And in the next generation, the secret bled forward again. Only this time the cover-up would become even darker, because the next royal wouldn't just carry the disease. He would be its living, dying proof. Hidden away, edited from photographs, and remembered only when it was too late. Now enter the prince who never got to grow old. 2. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany. He was born into perfection, the youngest son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And yet he arrived into a world that would never allow him to be perfect. Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, had inherited more than a title. He had inherited a quiet catastrophe written in his blood. From his first bruises, the royal physicians knew something wasn't right. The boy who could not heal became the boy who could not play. In an age obsessed with vigor, Leopold's fragility was a kind of treason. He watched his brothers ride, fence, and hunt, while he studied from armchairs and wrote letters in neat, self-conscious handwriting. He was clever. Some said the cleverest of Victoria's sons. But intelligence was a poor consolation in a world ruled by muscle and pageantry. His tutors described him as sweet-natured and melancholy. His mother called him my poor boy and my clever child in the same breath, as though intellect were compensation for pain. Hemophilia. The word was barely understood. In the 1860s, it was less a diagnosis than a sentence. Even doctors couldn't explain why a cut could linger, why a joint could swell, why rest was never enough. The royal household managed it as they did every family inconvenience, by keeping it quiet. The fewer people who knew, the safer the image of the monarchy remained. Leopold himself knew the truth, though. He understood that his life would be short, and he lived it as though defying that knowledge might lengthen it. He took up photography, philosophy, and politics. He wrote to friends about art and social reform. He pushed for education for the poor, corresponded with intellectuals, and even dared to travel, an act that terrified his physicians. Every departure from England was a roll of the dice. When he married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont, the union was met with cautious optimism. A royal wedding always promised stability, and for a time it seemed as if love might soften his condition. But genes are rarely sentimental. His daughter, Princess Alice of Albany, was born healthy, but she carried what he had carried, invisibly, inevitably. Leopold's final years were marked by a strange peace. He had outlived every expectation, though at a price. Constant pain, constant vigilance. His letters became softer, more philosophical. He often spoke about the burden of lineage, as though sensing the deeper inheritance that haunted his family. In March 1884, while in Cannes, he slipped. It was small, the kind of accident anyone might have. But for him, accidents were never small. Within hours, the family was summoned. Officially, he died peacefully after a short illness. In truth, it was the same unseen flaw that had followed him since birth, the one that no crown could conceal. Queen Victoria grieved him fiercely, though even in grief, she kept her decorum. She never spoke publicly about the cause. The nation mourned a prince. The family mourned a symptom. And yet, even in death, Leopold's story didn't end. Because the bloodline didn't end. His daughter would pass the same mysterious inheritance to her son, another royal child doomed to live under the shadow of an unexplained condition. The royal curse had learned to move quietly, like a rumor written in the veins of a dynasty. And the next chapter of that rumor was about to unfold in the life of a little boy hidden from view, a prince who would never be allowed to grow up in public. Before we dive into the first royal secret, take a second to subscribe. If you're into untold history, buried truths, and the kinds of stories that never made it into the official portraits, you're in the right place. And while you're here, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it as you listen? Midnight? Noon? Somewhere in between? Let's see how far this royal rabbit hole really reaches. 3. King George V. It was an empire of decorum. Crisp uniforms, silent servants, polished banisters, nothing out of place, nothing unexplained. King George V sat at the center of this immaculate order, like a man allergic to vulnerability. He wasn't a visionary, nor a poet, nor particularly affectionate. He was a former naval officer with a passion for stamps and discipline, a king who believed that duty was a kind of silence. And then came Prince John. Born in 1905, John was the youngest of George V's 6 children. The spare of the spare, a royal footnote from the beginning. At first he seemed ordinary enough, if a bit rambunctious. But by the age of 4, it was clear something was different. His behavior was erratic, his speech delayed, and he struggled with physical coordination. The palace physicians, with the medical vocabulary of the early 20th century, whispered words like nervous disorder and epileptic tendencies. Today, many believe he may have been autistic, or perhaps he simply existed beyond easy definition, a child who didn't fit the mold and therefore had to be made invisible. For the House of Windsor, imperfection was not just inconvenient, it was unspeakable. Prince John was slowly removed from public view. First it was fewer outings, then it was homeschooling, then a quiet relocation to Wood Farm, a secluded residence on the Sandringham estate. There he lived under the care of a governess and a staff who, by all accounts, genuinely adored him. But adoration was not the same as freedom. The royal family rarely visited. Photographs of John became scarce. He was 11 years old when he was last seen in an official portrait. His parents, George and Queen Mary, seldom spoke of him. It wasn't cruelty so much as policy. They believed, or perhaps needed to believe, that shielding him from public life was a kindness, a form of protection. After all, what would the world do with a prince who couldn't wave properly, who stammered, twitched, wandered? The monarchy was not built to accommodate such questions. John died in 1919 at the age of 13, after what was described as a seizure. His funeral was private. His name was largely erased from official biographies. Years later, Queen Mary would refer to him as a great anxiety, a line that hovers somewhere between maternal grief and institutional detachment. But here's the strange thing. The staff at Wood Farm remembered John as happy, mischievous, imaginative, affectionate. He had a pet pony. He made forts in the garden. He learned to tell time using his own made-up symbols. He was not a tragedy, until the world made him one. The mystery is not just what condition he had or how severe it was. The mystery is why his story had to disappear. Why a child, beloved by those who knew him, became a shadow in the family album. What did it say about the monarchy and about us, that a prince could vanish not through exile but through silence? Because John wasn't the only royal to live in the margins, just the first of the modern era. The next child with hidden struggles would arrive generations earlier, during a reign soaked in madness, with a king who knew all too well what it meant to lose control. And this time, it wasn't the child who was concealed. It was the entire royal legacy. 4. King George III. He was the king who lost America, but that was never the real scandal. The whispers that haunted the halls of Windsor and the corridors of Parliament weren't about Boston or tea or rebellion. They were about something far more intimate, far more unnerving. King George III was mad, or so they said. Not all the time, not in obvious ways, but enough. The madness came and went like weather, sometimes weeks of calm, sometimes storms of gibberish, delusion, wild-eyed prayers at midnight. And then silence, polite denial, a dignified carriage ride in the garden, as if nothing had ever happened. The physicians called it nervous fever, brain fever, melancholia. Later, it would be called porphyria, a genetic blood disorder with neurological effects. Later still, some scholars would question even that. But during his lifetime, there was no consensus. Only confusion and embarrassment. George fathered 15 children, and for a while, that seemed like evidence against the rumors. A madman doesn't produce a dynasty. A madman doesn't attend the opera, write essays on agriculture, or walk the palace halls quoting Latin poetry. But then the signs began to echo down the family line. His daughter, Princess Augusta Sophia, was described by courtiers as nervous, shy, oversensitive to noise, and prone to isolation. She never married, not for lack of suitors, but because she withdrew from courtship altogether. There were rumors of a secret heartbreak. There were louder rumors of something else: emotional instability, mood swings, an inexplicable refusal to live publicly. Then there was Prince Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, perhaps the most controversial of George's sons. Militaristic, volatile, politically extreme. He was accused of every scandal imaginable, from conspiracy to assault, most of which remain unproven. But beneath the public drama lay something subtler, a thread of unpredictable behavior, irrational rage, and social missteps that made even his allies uneasy. Ernest, some said, had inherited more than George's eyes. Were they truly disabled in a medical sense? That's the trick of royal history. The difference between illness and eccentricity often lies in who's holding the pen. In this family, emotional volatility was treated as political instability, and political instability was never just a private concern, it was dynastic rot. So even when symptoms appeared, anxiety, compulsions, long periods of withdrawal, the palace responded the way it always had, with polite silence and carefully managed rumors. George III's own breakdowns became legendary. Locked doors, physicians on call, public appearances canceled at the last minute. During one episode, he reportedly talked for hours without stopping, his words unraveling into chaos. During another, he mistook a tree for the King of Prussia and tried to shake its hand. But perhaps the most unsettling part of George III's story is not how he suffered. It's how normal his reign appeared from the outside. For decades, the machinery of monarchy carried on. Decrees were signed, balls were held, portraits were painted, all while the king slipped in and out of reality like a figure on a broken carousel. His children watched. Some inherited fragments of his affliction. Others carried only the silence around it. And the silence, as always, became hereditary. But if George's reign proved anything, it's that madness doesn't disqualify power. In fact, sometimes it reinforces it, especially when it's cloaked in velvet and lit by candlelight. And in the next royal generation, the velvet would stay, but the body would begin to fail in other quieter ways. Because even kings obsessed with strength can't outbreed fragility, and the Tudor obsession with male heirs was about to end with a child who was never strong enough to wear the crown for long. 5. King Henry VIII. The image of Henry VIII that history prefers is the one wielding power like a weapon. Broad-shouldered, bejeweled, eyes like a predator in heat. He's remembered as the king who split with the Pope, created his own church, married 6 women like they were seasonal fashions, and sent 2 of them to their deaths. A man obsessed with legacy, with virility, with sons. And yet, under all that royal bravado, Henry VIII may have been the most anxious father England ever had, because something kept going wrong with his children. Not in ways the court could admit aloud, but enough to make the line of succession a revolving question mark. His only legitimate son, Edward VI, was the prize, the long-awaited male heir, born to his third wife, Jane Seymour, who died days after his birth. At last, England had its future. But from infancy, Edward was frail. He was small for his age, thin-limbed, frequently ill, and plagued by mysterious ailments. Descriptions of his health vary, but most historians agree on this. Edward was a sickly child. He made it to the throne at 9. For 6 years he reigned, or rather his advisors did, while Edward grew paler and more withdrawn. By age 15, he was coughing blood and unable to walk long distances. He died before turning 16. Officially, it was tuberculosis. Unofficially, there were whispers of congenital defects, perhaps stemming from Henry's own health issues or something deeper in the Tudor gene pool. A prince who couldn't survive to adulthood, let alone produce children, was not just a personal tragedy. It was a constitutional problem. But Edward wasn't Henry's first child. There had been many before him. Pregnancies, miscarriages, stillbirths. Some scholars suggest that at least one of Henry and Catherine of Aragon's sons may have been born with visible abnormalities and died shortly after. It was never publicly acknowledged. Such things weren't. Infants who died without being christened were barely recorded, and those who were spoken of in euphemisms. Even Henry's surviving daughters weren't untouched. Mary, later known as Bloody Mary, suffered from what some believe were hormonal imbalances, possible phantom pregnancies, and lifelong episodes of melancholy. Elizabeth, though sharper than most of her counselors, had a famously erratic temperament, what today might be labeled as anxiety or compulsive tendencies. The Tudors, so determined to create the perfect heir, may have been caught in the very genetic web they hoped to escape. And here's the irony. For all Henry's obsession with health, with strong sons, with perfect succession, his bloodline produced a series of fragile monarchs both in body and in psyche. He broke the church to get a son, and the son broke before he could rule. Legacy, it turned out, didn't guarantee longevity, nor did it erase whatever hereditary ghosts were floating just beneath the ermine. But the crown didn't stop demanding. The next monarch would try even harder. She would endure 17 pregnancies in pursuit of one living heir. And when she finally got one, it would only raise more questions about divine punishment, about physical frailty, and about a child born to rule, but never to grow whole. 6. Queen Anne. She was the queen of endurance, not in the triumphant sense, not a warrior, not a conqueror, but in the quiet, cruel form that leaves you standing long after everyone you love has been buried. Queen Anne of Great Britain reigned over a united kingdom, but her personal life was a story of relentless loss. 17 pregnancies, one child who lived past infancy, none who lived to adulthood. The one exception, the brief hope, was Prince William, Duke of Gloucester. Born in 1689, he arrived as the answer to years of failed pregnancies and royal disappointment. The court rejoiced. A Protestant male heir, healthy enough to be christened and paraded. For a moment it seemed Anne's troubles had finally turned. But William was not healthy. Not really. Almost from birth, William exhibited signs of what would later be understood as hydrocephalus, a condition where fluid accumulates in the brain, causing pressure and, often, developmental complications. Contemporary accounts described him as unusually large-headed, with difficulty walking, and prone to seizures and sudden bouts of illness. His milestones were slow, his body small and awkward. He was doted on, certainly, his parents adored him, but there was always tension in the reports sent to the court. Behind the formal titles and hopeful announcements was the sense that the boy was not thriving. Still, he lived. And in a royal household where survival itself was rare, that was treated as enough. He was tutored, dressed in miniature uniforms, celebrated with carefully staged portraits. But privately, his condition never improved. His mobility was limited, his speech uncertain. The doctors did what they could. Bloodletting, diet changes, superstitious remedies, all useless. What no one dared to say was that the future king was never going to be king. He was a symbol more than a successor. William died just after his 11th birthday. The official cause was listed as a fever, but everyone knew the truth ran deeper. Anne, who had spent her life enduring miscarriages and bearing infants, was left again with no heir and no explanation. She was now a queen without a living child, sitting on a throne that demanded not just rule, but reproduction. And here's the part that history tends to skip over. Anne never stopped grieving. She wore black for the rest of her life, her body swollen with gout and grief. She ruled a newly unified kingdom while privately managing the collapse of her own genetic line. Her husband died. Her friends betrayed her. Her memory faded, even as her reign shaped the future of Britain. William, the fragile child who carried the weight of a nation's hope, became a quiet warning that all the planning, the breeding, the desperate marriages, none of it could predict who a child would be or whether they would survive the expectations placed on them. And yet, the same court that had buried Anne's child would continue the cycle. A new dynasty would soon take the throne, one born from foreign soil and political convenience. And among its first acts would be to bury a daughter alive, in a palace under lock and key for the sake of royal shame. 7. King George III. The Hanoverians arrived in Britain with powdered wigs, German accents, and a deep misunderstanding of English manners. King George III was never meant to charm the people, and he didn't. He barely spoke their language, showed little interest in their customs, and carried himself with the weary disinterest of a man who'd inherited a problem rather than a prize. But his personal life made his political coldness seem tame by comparison. He had once loved, or at least married, Sophia Dorothea of Chelay, a distant cousin with whom he shared both blood and bitterness. The union, politically convenient, quickly decayed into scandal. George had mistresses. Sophia Dorothea had an affair. He responded by divorcing her, not quietly, not kindly, and not in a way that permitted any form of rehabilitation. She was imprisoned, not metaphorically, not exiled with a pension and a polite farewell, but physically confined, locked away in Alden House in Lower Saxony, barred from contact with her children, forbidden to remarry, her name forbidden at court. She lived like that for over 30 years, a royal ghost, maintained but not acknowledged. And yet, the deeper mystery isn't the scandal of adultery or even the imprisonment. It's what happened to her after the doors closed. Contemporary letters and court records suggest that Sophia Dorothea began to show signs of mental illness in her middle years. Severe depression, paranoia, refusals to eat, periods of silence that lasted days, sudden weeping, long absences from any kind of social function, even the small controlled ones she was allowed within her confinement. Some accounts suggest she began to forget names, that she wrote long letters to people who had already died, that she was convinced her rooms were bugged, not with devices, of course, but with servants who could read her thoughts. None of this was confirmed publicly. The monarchy had no interest in publicizing the mental state of a disgraced consort. But the records kept by her household staff, and the writings of foreign ambassadors who managed to glean whispers of her condition, paint a portrait not just of imprisonment, but of psychological collapse. Was it genetic? Circumstantial? The result of confinement or something deeper in the bloodline? No one could say. But Sophia Dorothea's son, who would later become George II, grew up with a ghost for a mother and a father who never spoke of her. Her name was omitted from his coronation. Her death, in 1726, was marked with a funeral devoid of her children. She had become, by then, a national secret, one that had to be mourned quietly, or not at all. The royal family moved on. Britain had a new king, a new dynasty, and an ever-growing empire. But the silence surrounding Sophia Dorothea was never broken. She vanished not with scandal, but with time. And yet, this pattern, women forgotten, locked away, made to disappear for the sake of royal image, wasn't a Hanoverian invention. It was a tradition, one that would echo again in the lives of royal daughters born to see the world through blurred vision, sheltered from light, and remembered only as footnotes in someone else's reign. 8. King George II. By the time George II inherited the throne, the monarchy had become a machine, well-oiled, impersonal, and obsessed with appearances. He was not a sentimental ruler. His relationships, both personal and political, were defined by formality, discipline, and distance. But beneath the stiff portraits and powdered silence, one of his children quietly disrupted the royal symmetry, Princess Amelia. Born in 1711, Amelia was the kind of royal daughter history tends to blur into decorative anonymity, unmarried, dutiful, fond of horses and charity. But to those who observed her closely, there were anomalies. Her eyesight was weak, not just near or far-sightedness, but an unusual kind of visual deterioration that limited her ability to read, to navigate stairs, to engage in needlework or painting, the expected pastimes of a royal lady. In later life, she became functionally blind. The court never officially acknowledged this as a disability. It was treated instead as a delicate constitution. She was encouraged to rest often, excused from court appearances, and increasingly sheltered from public life. In private correspondence, she is described as sensitive to brightness, prone to dizziness, and delayed in certain faculties. Some letters hint at neurological complications, tremors, migraines, even periods of unexplained withdrawal. It wasn't just her eyes that seemed to be failing. It was something deeper, more systemic, more unsettling to a royal household that prized control. Amelia never married. Whether by choice or convenience, her life remained tethered to her family's shadow. She ran a household, oversaw charitable works, and was described by servants as gentle but often lost in thought, as if her mind lived slightly adjacent to the room she was in. There were stories of her wandering the gardens alone, speaking softly to herself. These accounts were rarely published, of course. Royals didn't suffer. They retired early. They weren't ill. They were sensitive. George II, for his part, rarely commented on his daughter's condition. He was a king who valued order, not introspection. But one might wonder what he thought, seeing his child gradually fade from the public eye. In a family already seasoned in the quiet redaction of inconvenient truths, from locked-away wives to erased sons, Amelia simply became another gentle disappearance. She died in 1786, aged 75, largely forgotten by the generation that followed her. No scandal, no marriage, no heirs. Her legacy was a quiet one, an existence lived on the margins of royal visibility, a name remembered mostly in footnotes and minor charities. But what Amelia represents is something the monarchy has never fully confronted: the slow erosion of visibility as a coping strategy. When a royal doesn't fit the narrative, too fragile, too different, too slow to perform, the system doesn't adapt. It edits. Softly, gently, bureaucratically, until even memory begins to forget. And yet, the next royal child would be harder to erase. Because when your heir starts to falter, you can't simply send them away. You have to rewrite the future around their silence, and pray no one notices the gaps. 9. King Edward VII. He was born to rule, eventually. The son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, Edward VII waited in the shadows for nearly 60 years before ascending the throne. And when he finally did, he brought with him the weary confidence of a man who had survived not just scandal, but his mother's crushing expectations. Known to his friends as Bertie, Edward was more sociable than scholarly, more interested in Parisian restaurants than parliamentary reform. But behind the charm and the waistcoats, there remained a quiet, persistent anxiety, especially about his eldest son. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, was born in 1864 and presented immediately to the world as the next great hope of the British monarchy. He had the right name, the right lineage, and a face fit for postage stamps. But beneath the public ceremonies and flattering portraits, something was off. Even as a child, Albert Victor appeared distant. Tutors found him slow to grasp ideas. His speech was described as muddled. He struggled with languages, had difficulty focusing, and showed little curiosity about the world around him, a worrying trait for someone being groomed to one day wear a crown. Royal biographers, writing decades later, and with great caution, would speculate that Albert Victor may have had a developmental disorder, perhaps something on the autism spectrum or a cognitive learning condition that went unrecognized and unspoken in his lifetime. But in his own era, such diagnoses did not exist. There was only the quiet panic of his handlers and the increasing effort to keep him dignified in public, coached in scripts and shielded from scrutiny. To the public, he was handsome and reserved. To those behind palace doors, he was an enigma, sweet-natured, agreeable, but often adrift in conversation. He rarely displayed initiative, required constant prompting, and seemed to live passively, as though rehearsing a role he never quite understood. And yet, because he was the heir's heir, his presence was non-negotiable. So the machinery of royal presentation went into overdrive. Appearances were choreographed, speeches ghost-written, his weaknesses politely overlooked. He was engaged briefly to Princess Mary of Teck, later Queen Mary, but the wedding was postponed, and then fate intervened. In 1892, at the age of 28, Albert Victor died suddenly of influenza during an epidemic. The official mourning was immense. The heir to the heir was gone. The royal family reeled. But behind the black veils and public grief, there may have been something else. A quiet sense of release. The pressure to prepare him for rule, to disguise his struggles, to frame his every public gesture as regal. It all evaporated in a matter of days. His younger brother, George, the future George V, took his place in the line of succession and eventually married Princess Mary, his late brother's fiancée. The dynasty moved on, as dynasties do, but Albert Victor's legacy remained shadowy, a mixture of romantic myth and whispered doubt. Some later rumors, none confirmed, even tied him to darker scandals, likely invented to fill the void his mystery left behind. But the deeper truth may be more mundane and more tragic, that he was a prince born into a role his mind could not support, in a system that could not afford to admit it. And the crown's discomfort with difference would only grow more elaborate in the next generation, because next came a queen, beloved by the world, whose family secrets would involve not one, but two royal children concealed behind institutional walls and falsified family records. 10. Queen Elizabeth II. To the world, she was duty-made flesh, stoic, unshakable, a fixed point in a century that seemed designed to spin. Queen Elizabeth II projected stability with such discipline that her own humanity sometimes appeared like a rumor. Her gestures were controlled, her tone unwavering, her emotional range carefully measured. But beneath the ritual and the rhythm of monarchy, there were fractures, quiet, deliberate absences, the sort that only become visible when you notice what isn't there. Those absences came in the form of two cousins, Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, daughters of the Queen Mother's brother. They were born into privilege in the 1910s, baptized into the same sacred bloodline that filled the Windsor veins. But unlike their famous relatives, the girls developed differently. Both had significant intellectual disabilities, the sort that, in another family, might have drawn compassion or advocacy. In this one, they drew fear. The early 20th century was not a kind time for people with cognitive impairments, least of all for the aristocracy. Eugenics, pseudoscience, and class anxiety all fused into one poisonous belief, that royal blood must remain pure, unblemished by weakness or deviation. So when it became clear that Nerissa and Catherine would not live the kind of lives expected of royal kin, a decision was made, quietly, bureaucratically, and without public notice. In 1941, both sisters were placed in the Royal Earlswood Institution for Mental Defectives in Surrey, a Victorian-era asylum built to separate the unfit from polite society. They were registered under false names. Their existence was erased from family gatherings, photographs, and eventually from genealogical records. In Burke's Peerage, the official register of British nobility, they were listed as deceased, decades before either of them had died. To the royal family, it was an act of protection, or so they said later. To historians, it looks more like an act of image management, because if the monarchy was meant to embody perfection, it could not acknowledge imperfection, not even within its own bloodline. Nerissa died in 1986, buried in a grave marked only by a plastic tag. Catherine lived until 2014, reportedly unaware of her lineage. Neither received visits from the royal household, though it was claimed that the family sent gifts at Christmas. The institution's staff, not courtiers or cousins, became their family. When the truth surfaced in the 1980s, it struck a rare nerve in the British public. How could the same monarchy that prided itself on compassion, duty, and national unity have hidden its own relatives for the sake of decorum? The palace's response was characteristically muted, a statement of regret, a polite reminder of the different attitudes of the time. But time doesn't absolve secrecy. It only deepens its irony. Queen Elizabeth, the most visible woman in the world, reigned over a family that still believed invisibility could solve embarrassment. And the irony cut deeper still, because the Queen herself was no stranger to personal imperfection. Her father, King George VI, had spent his life wrestling with a condition that made every public word a battle. And the monarchy's first great test under modern media would come not from scandal or rebellion, but from a king who couldn't quite say what he needed to say. 11. King George VI. He never wanted the throne. That much is clear. George VI was born the spare, the second son, the quiet one, the one meant to hover politely in the wings while his elder brother, Edward VIII, did the heavy lifting of monarchy. But fate and scandal had other plans. When Edward abdicated in 1936 to marry a divorced American, George was forced into the spotlight, reluctantly, nervously, and with a speech impediment that made every word feel like a battlefield. The nation knew him as the wartime king, the reluctant anchor of a country facing annihilation. But behind the scenes, his defining struggle wasn't just against fascism or fear. It was against his own voice. From childhood, George, known privately as Bertie, stammered. Not occasionally, not mildly, but with a severity that terrified his parents and humiliated him at court. Public speaking was agony. Even private conversation at times was a minefield of hesitations and blocks. In a world where kings were expected to speak with clarity and command, his stammer was more than a medical condition. It was a constitutional liability. The royal family tried everything: speech therapists, vocal coaches, even breathing drills borrowed from opera singers. One of his most famous tutors, Lionel Logue, was an Australian elocutionist who believed that emotional trauma, not just physical dysfunction, sat at the root of the problem. Their sessions became legendary, later dramatized in The King's Speech. But what that sanitized version glossed over was the deeper reality, that George VI's stammer wasn't simply a quirk to be overcome. It was a lifelong struggle that reshaped the very architecture of the monarchy. Every speech was a crisis. Every public event, a negotiation between panic and poise. His Christmas broadcasts were meticulously rehearsed, his lines broken into manageable beats, his breaths timed like a metronome. And still, the stammer sometimes won. He wasn't the only one in the family to face these kinds of hurdles. His daughter, Princess Margaret, reportedly experienced subtle developmental delays as a child. Nothing severe, but noticeable enough to be discussed privately. She had difficulty concentrating, sometimes struggled with coordination, and took longer than her sister to master the rituals of royal behavior. In an ordinary family, it might have passed without comment. In this one, it was cause for concern, not because she was failing, but because she wasn't seamless. The House of Windsor, by this point, had grown expert at masking. Vulnerabilities were framed as eccentricities. Conditions became nervous habits. Disorders were brushed aside as personal challenges. George VI's stammer was never fully hidden. It was too obvious. But it was wrapped in layers of patriotic struggle, transformed into a symbol of moral courage. And perhaps it was. But the deeper question lingers. What happens when the face of the nation cannot speak? When the voice of the crown comes in fits and pauses, the monarchy demands fluency, not just in language, but in image, in control, in the myth of inherited strength. George VI broke that myth quietly every time he stepped behind a microphone. Not with scandal or rebellion, but with tremors, silence, and the slow ache of trying to be perfect in a system allergic to imperfection. And yet he was far from the first royal to wrestle with inherited instability. The roots of this struggle went back centuries, into the Stuart line, where kings and queens passed more than crowns to their children. They passed ghosts, and the next to inherit them would be born into a court of masks where the brightest minds often carried the darkest questions. 12. King James VI of England. He was the scholar king, fluent in Latin and Greek, obsessed with theology, fond of witch trials, and deeply convinced of divine right. King James I of England and VI of Scotland carried himself like a philosopher in a crown, quoting scripture and Aristotle in the same breath. But behind the intellectual flair and poetic patronage was a body often out of sync with its mind, and a bloodline shadowed by instability that refused to stay politely in the past. James had what some contemporaries called strange affections of the nerves. He walked awkwardly, often needing assistance with movement. He drooled in youth, stammered in moments of stress, and displayed compulsive tics that made foreign ambassadors quietly raise their eyebrows. By modern standards, he might fall somewhere on the neurodivergent spectrum, though the term, of course, did not exist. What did exist were courtiers who knew how to pretend they saw nothing, and historians who knew how to write around it. Yet despite his bodily discomforts, James was fiercely intelligent, an avid debater, an obsessive writer, and deeply paranoid. His letters are peppered with sudden shifts in tone, veering from warm affection to suspicion without warning. He trusted no one completely, not even his own children. And for good reason. They were born into a world where loyalty was conditional, and legacy was not always kind. His daughter, Princess Elizabeth, was the brightest star of his offspring, married into the Palatinate, and remembered by many as a dignified, politically savvy figure. But it's in her descendants that the mystery deepens. Several of Elizabeth's children, raised in the patchwork courts of the Holy Roman Empire, showed signs of mental or emotional irregularity. One son, Prince Rupert, was described by observers as brilliant but erratic, capable of intense focus one moment and reckless disregard the next. Another, Prince Maurice, died young under circumstances laced with rumor. But the most haunting legacy came not from the sons, but from the pattern. Across multiple branches of the Stuart bloodline, particularly those that married back into European dynasties, there appears to be a recurring thread of what 17th century chroniclers called melancholy, madness, or simply trouble of the head. These weren't the poetic brooding of a Hamlet-type prince. These were real impairments, often managed behind closed doors, sometimes ending in lifelong seclusion. Was it genetic? Was it the inbreeding? Or was it simply the inevitable result of royal life, the isolation, the pressure, the ceremonial performance of normality under impossible expectations. James himself might have asked those questions had he lived in an era that allowed for them, but his worldview offered no such nuance. In his court, deviation from norm was often seen as divine punishment, or worse, evidence of demonic interference. He quite literally wrote the book on witches, after all. And yet, for all his fears of devils and dissent, he could not exorcise what was quietly winding itself through his lineage, a neurological inheritance dressed in royal lace. That inheritance would echo again, not just in sons and grandsons, but in a child born to his granddaughter. A boy who would one day unify crowns and rewrite empires while hiding compulsions, anxieties, and traits that today would raise more medical than theological eyebrows. But in his time, there was only one diagnosis that mattered. He was the king, and kings could not afford to appear haunted. 13. Mary, Queen of Scots. She is remembered for drama, long skirts sweeping through candlelit halls, love letters written in cipher, betrayals carved into history like an opera libretto. Mary, Queen of Scots, was a woman whose life played out at the collision point between myth and monarchy. Catholic in a Protestant country, beautiful in a brutal time, and royal in a world that preferred its queens quiet. But what history often skips past, or veils in romantic tragedy, is what she passed down. Not just her lineage, but her legacy of instability. Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, inherited his mother's crown, her political instincts, and perhaps more quietly, her unease. He grew into the scholar king of two kingdoms, clever and paranoid in equal measure. But he wasn't the last stop in this peculiar chain. The traits that marked his reign, obsessive thoughts, social awkwardness, episodes of irrational suspicion, seemed to ripple forward through his descendants, becoming more pronounced, more disruptive, and far harder to disguise. Some modern scholars look back on James and his successors and ask whether what we're seeing isn't just personality, but heritability. A thread of neurodivergence or neurological sensitivity running from Mary's bloodline into the tangled roots of the Stuart dynasty. There's no clean medical term, no conclusive diagnosis, just a pattern. A series of royals who spoke too fast or too little, who were too still or too volatile, who obsessed, retreated, or collapsed under the weight of their roles. Mary herself showed signs of emotional extremes long before her tragic downfall. As a teenager, she was vivacious and flirtatious, but also moody and impulsive, traits that courtiers both adored and feared. She married young, widowed early, married again, badly, and watched her second husband's murder split her reign in half. Her decisions weren't just controversial, they were erratic, unpredictable, sometimes reckless. Even her supporters admitted she was hard to advise, harder to calm. Her imprisonment in England, ordered by her cousin Elizabeth I, lasted 19 years. During that time, she penned reams of letters, often riddled with obsession over plots and coded promises. Her mind stayed sharp, but her sense of reality often blurred. She feared betrayal around every corner. She made alliances that contradicted each other, and yet, she still styled herself the rightful Queen of England, even as her world narrowed to a handful of guarded rooms and a quill. The Stuarts would inherit all of this: the elegance, the turmoil, and the shadows. What began with Mary's charm and James's compulsions would culminate generations later in a monarch who could barely hold his sanity together long enough to rule. But the line didn't just pass through sons and kings. It also passed through queens and mothers. And one of those daughters, married off for politics, exported like porcelain to an enemy court, would carry the very same instability into the next great dynasty. And with her, the bloodline would split again, this time into England, France, and the pages of European psychiatry. 14. King Charles VI of France. He wasn't British. But his madness was. At least it became Britain's problem the moment his daughter Catherine of Valois married Henry V of England, a union forged not in romance but in royal accounting. Her dowry was a peace treaty, her womb a political time bomb, and within it she carried the legacy of a man known throughout Europe as Charles the Mad. King Charles VI of France began his reign with promise, young, intelligent, and ambitious. But by his mid-20s, something began to unravel. He suffered from violent rages, delusions of being made of glass, and long periods where he failed to recognize his own family. There were times he ran through the palace in fear, others when he could not be roused to speak. Historians have debated the cause for centuries. Schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, encephalitis, or perhaps a hereditary condition worsened by generations of inbreeding. Whatever it was, it shaped not only the French monarchy, but the English one too. Because Catherine of Valois did not just bring a crown, she brought blood. Her marriage to Henry V was brief, a few years of diplomatic matrimony, ending with his sudden death. Their son, Henry VI of England, was only 9 months old when he inherited both kingdoms. A baby with one crown on each side of his crib, and the genes of a father who conquered and a grandfather who collapsed. The Tudors liked to blame Henry VI's later mental breakdowns on stress. And there was plenty of it: wars, rebellions, politics, power. But his episodes bore a disturbing resemblance to those of Charles VI. Sudden catatonia, long silences, confused speech, hallucinations. For a time, he forgot he was king. At other times, he remembered only parts of himself. And yet, no one dared speak openly about the possibility that this was inherited. Even as Henry VI's reign crumbled under the weight of his mind, his advisors focused on external causes: poor counsel, bad fortune, disloyal subjects. But behind the scenes, there were whispers that the boy had been doomed before he ever learned to speak. That madness, once planted in the line, would always find its way to the surface. And what of Catherine? She outlived her husband, but not the legacy. Widowed and politically sidelined, she eventually formed a controversial relationship with Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier, a match considered beneath her rank. From that union came another bloodline, one that would eventually produce Henry VII and the Tudor dynasty. And so the madness of Charles VI found its way into 2 thrones, France and England, through a princess no one truly understood, and a marriage made for treaties, not trust. If Charles VI haunts British royal history, it's not because of his own reign, but because his echoes are still faintly heard in the medical euphemisms of royal biographies, in the sanitized silence around fragile heirs, and in the way certain family traits never quite disappear, no matter how many generations wear the crown. The blood moved forward. Through Tudor daughters and Yorkist claims, through carefully negotiated marriages and tragic early deaths. And next, it would emerge again, quietly, in a royal household where fragility was noticed, not feared, and a little girl's oddness was written off as charm, until the court began to whisper that she might never grow into her crown. 15. King Edward III. He was called Longshanks, a king of iron will and brutal campaigns, a man remembered for crushing rebellions, building castles with cold precision, and waging war as if it were a royal instinct. King Edward I of England carved his legacy into the bones of the British Isles, but for all his strength on the battlefield, he was no less vulnerable to the quiet weaknesses that stalked his bloodline. Because in his long list of children, at least 16 known, many of them born in royal palaces, cradled in silk and certainty, one child did not follow the pattern. Her name was Joan of Acre, and she was different. Born in 1272 in the city of Acre, while her parents were on crusade in the Holy Land, Joan entered the world under the shadow of violence and divine ambition. She was brought back to England at a young age, raised in a court of strict etiquette and tightly managed expectations. As the daughter of a king famed for his discipline and strategic coldness, Joan was expected to serve the crown, through marriage, through diplomacy, through obedience. But the records hint at a child who never quite matched the royal blueprint. Some chroniclers, particularly those writing decades after her death, refer to her in coded language: frail, strange of habit, simple in disposition. Others mention her being withdrawn from ceremony and absent from the Queen's mirror court. In an age that did not have terms for neurodivergence or developmental differences, this language stands out. It suggests not physical illness, but a difference in perception, behavior, or cognition. Something subtle enough to overlook, yet persistent enough to mention. Always in whispers, always with disclaimers. And yet, Joan wasn't excluded from royal life. She was married twice, first to Gilbert de Clare, the powerful Earl of Gloucester, a political match, sealed before she was even a teenager. She had 4 children with him. After his death, she remarried, this time for love. Her second husband, Ralph de Monthermer, was a commoner. A scandal. She married him in secret, reportedly without her father's permission, and suffered the consequences. Edward was furious. He confiscated her lands, imprisoned Ralph, and only relented when Joan gave birth to another child, forcing the king's hand by turning scandal into dynasty. Was this a sign of emotional instability? Rebellion? Or just an unusually headstrong princess making the only free choice she'd ever had? It's impossible to say, but the way Joan disappears from the record shortly after, dying at the age of 35, her health described as delicate, suggests that something about her life, or her body, or her mind, was always handled quietly. Her story doesn't end in infamy or war. It ends in soft omission. She was buried in Clare Priory, and her tomb has long since faded into the historical background. A royal daughter who, for reasons no one quite wrote down, never became a political asset nor a cautionary tale. Just a curiosity. But the lineage she belonged to, and the questions she raised, would echo again in her ancestors. Because Edward's legacy wasn't just conquest and castles. It was a long line of children and grandchildren, many of whom carried something fragile beneath their titles. And one of them, a generation later, would suffer a far more public undoing. A girl born to reign, married off for politics, and driven slowly toward a silence no throne could protect her from. 16. Henry II of England. He was the architect of the Angevin Empire, a monarch of volcanic energy and volcanic temper, a king who ruled more land than any Englishman before him, and trusted almost no one, including his own children. Henry II of England governed through intimidation, strategy, and sheer intellectual horsepower. He surrounded himself with lawyers, built institutions, fought with bishops, and kept Europe's crowns within sword's reach. But for all his dynastic cunning, there was one child he could not maneuver into the historical light. Her name was Eleanor of England, and like many royal women of the 12th century, her life was meant to be symbolic. A diplomatic marriage, a secure alliance, a loyal daughter turned noble asset. Born in 1162, Eleanor was the 6th child of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, a princess by birth and eventually a countess by marriage. She was wedded to Alfonso VIII of Castile at the age of 14, a move designed to tether England's influence to the Iberian Peninsula. On paper, she fulfilled her purpose. In practice, the historical trail she left behind is hazy and darker than most court chronicles cared to explain. At first, the union appeared successful. Eleanor bore several children, including Berengaria of Castile, who would become queen consort of England through her marriage to Richard the Lionheart, Eleanor's own brother. And yet, within decades, reports emerged from Castile that Henry's daughter had begun to retreat from public life. The official explanations were vague: declining health, religious devotion, sorrow following the deaths of her children. But behind the formal narrative, something more troubling was quietly acknowledged in court letters and monastic chronicles, that Eleanor had become increasingly withdrawn, unpredictable, and emotionally volatile. Spanish sources refer to a period of seclusion and silence in her later years. Others mention melancholy that would not lift and visions or episodes of confusion that left her attendants unsure how to respond. Some historians have speculated that Eleanor may have developed a form of late-onset mental illness, perhaps triggered by grief, isolation, or genetic predisposition. One account from a Castilian monastery describes her as a lady of high bearing, once noble in conversation, now troubled in spirit and distant in eye. Another mentions a chronic nervous affliction that required her to be moved away from court into quieter surroundings. There are no direct medical records. None were kept in that time, but the pattern is familiar to modern readers. A royal who begins to disappear, not from the world, but from herself. It's tempting to view this as an isolated case, a royal woman worn down by loss and duty. But when viewed in the larger context of the Plantagenet line, it begins to look less like anomaly and more like inheritance. Henry II himself was known for his violent mood swings and erratic decision-making. His sons, particularly Richard and John, displayed impulsiveness, suspicion, and, in John's case, bursts of cruelty that bordered on the pathological. The family was brilliant, yes, but not balanced. And Eleanor's disappearance into obscurity didn't end the pattern, it merely passed it forward. Because the next generation of Plantagenets would bring the instability even closer to the throne, not hidden in castles abroad, but seated on it. And the king who followed would be remembered not for his policies or wars, but for the way his mind unraveled in public, as if history were finally tired of pretending. 17. King Richard II. He was crowned at 10 years old, dressed in gold, and burdened with expectation. King Richard II inherited a throne still quivering from rebellion, and from the start, the weight of the crown never quite fit his head, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he lacked something far more elusive: stability. To his supporters, Richard was refined, artistic, divinely inspired. To his enemies, he was erratic, petulant, and dangerous. To posterity, he remains one of the most psychologically enigmatic monarchs in English history, a king whose reign was less a tale of politics than of temperament, and whose mind, according to many chroniclers, was at war with itself. Born in 1367, Richard was the grandson of Edward III and the son of Edward the Black Prince, who died before ascending the throne. That left Richard, a child, in line for the crown during a period of deep political unrest. As a boy king, he survived the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 with surprising composure, confronting rebel leader Wat Tyler face to face. But this early act of courage turned out to be the exception, not the pattern. As he matured, the public began to notice things that didn't quite add up. He surrounded himself with a tight circle of favorites and seemed to withdraw from the traditional structures of court. He became obsessed with ceremony, ritual, and the divine nature of kingship. His approach to ruling was theatrical, sometimes literally. He would commission elaborate pageants and religious performances in his honor. He had himself depicted in portraits not as a man, but as a Christ-like figure, radiant and untouchable. But beneath the polished surface was a pattern of paranoia and sudden, impulsive cruelty. He could be calm one moment, then lashing out the next. His punishments were often severe and disproportionate. Nobles exiled without cause, property confiscated, old allies turned into enemies overnight. He seemed to believe that his authority was absolute, not in the constitutional sense, but in the metaphysical one. Many of his contemporaries, including chroniclers like Thomas Walsingham, openly questioned his mental stability. They described him as prone to brooding, disconnected from reality, and unable to manage contradiction. Some noted episodes of what we might now recognize as dissociation, moments when he appeared unaware of his surroundings or spoke as though in a trance. His downfall was almost inevitable. In 1399, Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV, returned from exile, claimed the throne, and deposed Richard without much resistance. The king was arrested, imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, and eventually died under circumstances that remain vague and suspicious. Officially, he wasted away. Unofficially, it was the final chapter in a reign defined by unraveling, of trust, of power, and perhaps of the king's own mind. But Richard's story is not unique in his family tree. He was a Plantagenet, and the line was heavy with rulers who burned bright and broke early. The volatility wasn't just personal, it was generational. And the next to wear the crown would take that inheritance to new depths, embodying not just emotional instability, but what modern historians now suspect was a profound neurological disorder. A king who would vanish not in battle, but inside his own body, one step away from catatonia and one step closer to the end of a dynasty. 18. King Henry VI. If a monarchy can be haunted, Henry VI's reign was a séance conducted in daylight. A slow, unsettling presence that everyone could feel, but no one could explain. He was born into war, crowned as an infant, and inherited 2 kingdoms before he could walk. England and France were his by blood, but neither would remain his for long. Because from the start, Henry VI was not like other kings, and everyone around him knew it. Born in 1421, the only child of Henry V and Catherine of Valois, Henry became King of England at just 9 months old, and through his mother, King of France at age 10. He was surrounded by regents, clerics, and power-hungry nobles who used the boy's silence as a blank slate for their ambitions. But the silence never ended. Henry was gentle, devout, unassertive, and curiously passive. These might be admirable traits in a monk. For a monarch in the midst of the 100 Years' War, they were catastrophic. He showed little interest in governance. He struggled to assert himself in council. He preferred reading scripture to commanding troops. While the nation boiled with unrest, Henry remained serene, even disconnected. Many chroniclers, even sympathetic ones, described him as simple. Others hinted at something more clinical. But it wasn't until 1453, when Henry was 31, that his condition could no longer be denied. That year, without warning, he suffered what modern scholars believe was a complete mental breakdown. He stopped speaking. He no longer recognized his newborn son. He stared through his courtiers as if they weren't there. He was entirely unresponsive for over a year. No orders, no reactions, no awareness of his surroundings. Today, many believe Henry suffered from catatonic schizophrenia, or a related neurological disorder, likely inherited. After all, his maternal grandfather was Charles VI of France, whose infamous psychosis had haunted his reign decades earlier. The same Charles who believed he was made of glass and forgot his own name. That same flicker of detachment, of the mind quietly exiting the body, seemed to pass, generation to generation, across crowns and borders. Even after Henry partially recovered in 1455, he was never the same. His episodes of withdrawal returned periodically, often triggered by stress. He became a puppet for rival factions, the Lancastrians and Yorkists, who dragged him like a religious relic through the Wars of the Roses. He was captured, deposed, restored, and deposed again. At every turn, he seemed less like a ruler and more like a tragic symbol, a hollow crown. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, did much of the ruling in his place, fiercely defending his claim and that of their son, Edward of Westminster. But Edward, too, presented challenges. Reports from his youth suggest he was prone to violent outbursts, intense mood swings, and an unnerving enthusiasm for warfare far beyond his years. Some called him the young savage. Others wondered, more quietly, whether something unnatural had taken hold in the bloodline. Not just madness, but something deeper, untamed, and unnameable. Henry VI died in the Tower of London in 1471, under circumstances that were, at best, ambiguous. Officially, it was melancholy. unofficially, political convenience. Either way, he left behind a kingdom in ruin and a legacy that was never quite allowed to make sense. But the monarchy would not purge this shadow so easily. The crown simply passed it forward, into yet another line, another child, another tightly controlled courtship between power and denial. And next, it would reappear not in the chaos of open warfare, but in the quiet, tragic body of a little girl whose fragility would be recorded in silk letters and funeral hymns. 19. King James II. In the official portraits, he looks composed, slightly aloof, eyes half-lidded with princely boredom, the gaze of a man who'd rather be on a battlefield than in a throne room. King James II of England and VII of Scotland is usually remembered for his religious stubbornness, his forced Catholicism in a Protestant country, and his swift removal from the throne during the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But like many monarchs before him, his public legacy masks a private thread, one woven into his bloodline and embodied, briefly and heartbreakingly, by his daughter. Princess Louisa Maria Stuart, the youngest of James's many children, was born in exile at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, France, in 1692, 4 years after her father had lost his crown and fled the only country that ever technically belonged to him. Louisa was born into a court of broken dreams, Jacobite loyalists still clinging to the fantasy of a Stuart restoration, French courtiers politely tolerating their royal guests, and her aging parents, James and Mary of Modena, trying to hold on to the illusion of dynasty. At first, she was presented as a symbol of hope, a new princess, a possible link to legitimacy. But almost immediately, there were concerns. Louisa was described in court letters as delicate, feeble, and sickly from birth. She was prone to fevers, often bedridden, and described by attendants as having little energy. She grew slowly, physically and socially. While other children of noble birth were learning court etiquette and languages, Louisa spent much of her short life attended by physicians, confined to bedchambers, and spoken of in cautious, reverent tones. Modern historians suspect she may have had a congenital illness, something that weakened her immune system or affected her neurological development. Her speech was described as halting, her motor skills underdeveloped. Some accounts suggest that her mother, Mary of Modena, feared exposing Louisa to the public not only because of illness, but because of how visibly fragile she appeared. Yet in the portraits commissioned during her life, she is rendered with almost aggressive normalcy. Rosy cheeks, pearl necklaces, regal posture. It was as if the court was painting over her real condition, replacing the child with a symbol. Because that's what she had to be. The exiled Stuart court couldn't afford imperfection. They were clinging to an image of divine right, of hereditary power, of the mystical Stuart touch. Admitting that their last-born princess might be unwell, or unable to rule, was politically fatal. Louisa died at the age of 9. The official cause was listed as a sudden illness, but it was no surprise to those who had seen her fading for years. Her death sent ripples through the Jacobite court, not just grief but fear. Because now, the myth was harder to maintain. The last child of James II was gone, and with her went the image of a reborn Stuart monarchy, purified and perfected through divine providence. The irony, of course, was that Louisa had never been a threat to anyone. She was a sick child born into a collapsing legacy, but the monarchy, even in exile, still demanded silence, still edited the story, still chose symbolic fiction over fragile truth, and that pattern didn't die with the Stuarts. It simply shifted forms, waiting for the next generation of royals to discover that even divine blood can carry shadows. Shadows that would follow them back to England, back to the throne, and back into the lives of children whose seizures and silence would once again become secrets too dangerous to name. 20. King Henry he was the fourth son of William the Conqueror, never expected to rule, never supposed to inherit anything beyond his own ambition. And yet, King Henry III outlived his older brothers, seized the crown of England in a moment of political chaos, and ruled with the cold precision of a man who knew power was never safe. He was calculating, shrewd, and unusually literate for a medieval king. But beneath the administrative brilliance and dynastic maneuvering was the same old flaw that seemed to chase every royal bloodline: a child born into shadows. Her name was Matilda of Perche, one of Henry's many illegitimate daughters. And yes, there were many. Henry I is believed to have fathered over 20 children out of wedlock, an entire web of offspring scattered across courts, monasteries, and quiet rural estates. Most of them were strategically married off to solidify alliances. But not Matilda. What little we know about her comes from monastic chronicles, the dusty margins of medieval record-keeping, where the lives of less politically convenient royals tend to linger. Matilda was born in the early 1100s, probably raised in Normandy, and eventually married into the House of Perche, a powerful French noble family. Her husband, Rotrou III, Count of Perche, was a warrior, a crusader, a man whose legacy was soaked in blood and battlefield glory. Hers was something else entirely. Contemporary sources describe Matilda as suffering from falling sickness, the medieval term for what we now understand as epilepsy. At the time, epilepsy was feared, misunderstood, and often treated as evidence of divine punishment or spiritual possession. It was not seen as a medical condition, but as a rupture in the soul, a flaw that brought shame to both the afflicted and their kin. That shame mattered more when the blood in question was royal. There's no record of Matilda attending major court functions, no trace of her in ceremonial roles, and no detailed chronicle of her contributions as a countess. What we do find are vague references to her ill humors, sacred fits, and withdrawal from public life. Her seizures were said to be frequent and unpredictable. At times, she was confined to bed for weeks. At others, she was sent to religious houses for what was diplomatically called reflection, but more likely amounted to cloistered care and social containment. Her husband, Rotrou, appears to have remained loyal, or at least quiet. But even his own chronicles mention her sparingly. When Matilda died, her funeral was conducted without fanfare, her tomb marked modestly, if at all. No monuments, no public mourning, no royal epitaph carved into history. She was a daughter of a king, a countess by marriage, and a woman whose condition stripped her of both visibility and significance in the official record. And yet she left a mark, a subtle, unsettling reminder that royal blood could carry more than privilege. It could carry stigma, illness, something uncontrollable, something that could not be smoothed over by heraldry or holy oil. Henry I, who famously lost his legitimate son in the White Ship disaster, tried to shape his dynasty with steel and strategy. But Matilda's story, hidden, overlooked, and quietly erased, exposes the truth behind the throne, that kings could not outplan their own biology. And as we move down the bloodline, the pattern only sharpens. Because the next chapter belongs not to a royal daughter hidden in the countryside, but to one whose very mind would become the subject of whispered diagnoses, a princess who spoke strangely, lived restlessly, and would eventually be remembered as mad, though no one dared say it while she lived. 21. King Edward I's granddaughter, Joan of Bar. The chronicles remember her only in passing, a faint footnote in the long shadow of medieval kings. Joan of Bar, granddaughter of King Edward I, was born into privilege that guaranteed her nothing. She was connected by blood to conquerors and crusaders, yet her life unfolded in quiet confinement and courtly whispers. While her male relatives carved their names into stone, Joan's legacy was written in rumor. And like so many royal women of her time, her story was not destroyed by scandal, but dissolved by silence. Born around 1295 to Henry III, Count of Bar, and Eleanor of England, Joan grew up between two worlds, the chivalric courts of France and the diplomatic gravity of England. She was a political link between kingdoms, an asset in silk. But from the beginning, her health and her behavior drew attention. Chroniclers described her as pale, delicate, and withdrawn, an early medieval euphemism that could mean anything from frailty to mental distress. In the most telling accounts, she was referred to as the lady who sees ghosts, or the one who speaks to none. By adolescence, she had been betrothed to John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, a man nearly 20 years her senior. The match, like most royal alliances, was not optional. But something about it never quite worked. Letters preserved in later archives suggest that Joan's disposition made her difficult to engage with. She rarely spoke, avoided social gatherings, and often had to be guided by attendants. The betrothal stalled, was renegotiated, and eventually dissolved, leaving both families embarrassed. What happened next was stranger still. After her failed engagement, Joan largely disappeared from official court life. The few surviving documents about her adulthood come not from royal clerks, but from church records. Monks in the Abbey of Cluny mention a Joan, Countess, of noble birth, troubled in spirit. Another manuscript from the Benedictine house at Noyon references her periods of divine silence, a phrase that medieval theologians used for women whose speech or thought seemed disconnected from reality. Modern historians have speculated that Joan may have suffered from what would now be recognized as a psychiatric illness, perhaps depression, or a psychotic condition that manifested in retreat and confusion. Others believe she may have had an undiagnosed neurological disorder that affected speech and memory. In her own time, however, there was no language for this beyond the spiritual. To the clergy, she was afflicted by visions. To her family, she was mad. And yet, even in this obscurity, Joan's lineage mattered. When her cousin Edward III rose to power decades later, she briefly reappeared in the records, this time as a ward of the crown. She was granted a pension for her upkeep and the supervision of attendants, an arrangement that reads today as halfway between guardianship and house arrest. Her name vanished again soon after. The date of her death is uncertain. What remains is the tone of her memory, not scandalized, not cruel, but oddly respectful, as if her family believed that what plagued her was beyond blame. In a world that punished deviation harshly, Joan's condition was treated less as a disgrace and more as a quiet misfortune, one best left unspoken. But silence, in royal bloodlines, never means resolution. It means inheritance. Joan's story, her confusion, her distance, her ghostly presence in the archives, would echo again in later centuries, when the Hanoverian kings would grapple with their own daughters, whose minds seemed to flicker between light and shadow. And the next to face it would not be a forgotten princess in France, but a future English monarch whose daughter's suffering would unfold under the cold scrutiny of the Georgian court. 22. King George IV. George IV was the kind of monarch who seemed more interested in chandeliers than crowns. Extravagant, theatrical, and deeply committed to the illusion of refinement. He was a man of ornate tastes and erratic moods, both of which he wore like medals. By the time he inherited the throne in 1820, he had already served as Prince Regent for nearly a decade, and Britain had learned to live under his elaborate shadow. But behind the courtly indulgence and public scandals was a quieter sorrow, a daughter born into privilege and pain, who would not survive her father's reign, nor the weight of her own body. Princess Charlotte of Wales, the only legitimate child of George IV and his estranged wife Caroline of Brunswick, was supposed to be the great hope of the House of Hanover. She was popular with the public, spirited, intelligent, and, unusually for her family, genuinely beloved. In an age when monarchs were seen as remote symbols of inherited duty, Charlotte felt almost human. She laughed in public. She spoke her mind, and yet, from the very beginning, her body seemed to carry more than its fair share of burden. Contemporary accounts describe Charlotte as clumsy and slow to walk, with a slightly uneven gait and frequent health complaints that worsened as she matured. Though vibrant in personality, Her physical health was fragile. Her spine, noted by physicians of the time, showed signs of curvature, a likely case of scoliosis, or possibly another congenital spinal deformity. Her gait was unsteady, and she often suffered from bouts of exhaustion that left her bedridden for days. Some close to the family also suggested she experienced fainting spells and episodes of what they called nerve storms, language that suggests undiagnosed neurological symptoms. Adding to her vulnerability were the relentless expectations placed upon her as the heir to the throne. George IV, vain and domineering even at a distance, treated his daughter as a political asset rather than a person. He controlled her education, restricted her social life, and refused to allow her to see her mother. Charlotte, rebellious and emotionally sensitive, bore the pressure with both courage and increasing instability. Her marriage to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg in 1816 was, for a brief time, a national fairy tale. The people loved them. They were seen as a modern couple, affectionate, principled, and deeply in love. But Charlotte's health continued to fluctuate. Her first pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. Her second, in 1817, was closely monitored by a team of physicians. She was in labor for over 50 hours, eventually giving birth to a stillborn son. Charlotte herself died hours later, at just 21 years old. The public grief was immense. The mourning was national. But beneath the black veils and solemn tributes, another truth lingered. Charlotte's medical fragility had been present all along, quietly tolerated, quietly ignored. Her spinal deformity, her unexplained fits of weakness, her periods of fatigue, all had been pushed aside in favor of what she symbolized. George IV never recovered from her death, not emotionally and not dynastically. Charlotte's passing left the throne without a direct heir, triggering a dynastic scramble that would reshape the monarchy. But it also left behind a quieter question. What would her life have been if her illness had been treated, not hidden? If her symptoms had been explored, not erased? Because Charlotte was not the only royal woman shaped by invisible suffering. And in the generation that followed, the royal silence around mental illness and neurological fragility would take on an even more unsettling shape, one that would involve the walls of an asylum, falsified records, and two women airbrushed out of the family tree. 23. Princess Alice of Battenberg. She was born into royalty, married into royalty, and gave birth to royalty. And yet, Princess Alice of Battenberg spent most of her life on the periphery of it, obscured by the polite shadows of courtly conversation. Born in 1885 at Windsor Castle, Alice was the great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, mother to Prince Philip, and grandmother to King Charles III. But long before she became a footnote in royal genealogies or a fleeting mention in coronation broadcasts, she was a mystery the monarchy quietly kept at arm's length. Alice's early life unfolded with the usual rituals of upper-class European childhood: governesses, language tutors, piano lessons. She was intelligent, charming, and fluent in multiple languages, but from a young age, something else set her apart. She was almost completely deaf. Diagnosed at the age of 5, her condition was congenital, likely the result of a recessive gene. It did not slow her academically, but it left her isolated. She learned to lip read in multiple languages, a skill she mastered so well that many forgot she was hearing impaired at all. But communication, especially in noisy royal rooms full of whispers and coded tension, was always a barrier. In 1903, she married Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, and over the next 2 decades her life unraveled under the weight of war, exile, and emotional strain. The Greco-Turkish War left her family destitute and stateless. Her husband was tried for treason and narrowly escaped execution. They fled, again and again, with their children, including young Philip, who would eventually find refuge with British relatives while his mother quietly disintegrated in the background. By the late 1920s, Alice was no longer simply melancholy. She began claiming divine visions. She believed she was receiving messages from God. She gave away her possessions, fasted compulsively, and spoke of becoming a nun. Her behavior alarmed the royal circles around her, not because of its spiritual content, but because it was unmanageable. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia by physicians in Germany and Switzerland, including the controversial Dr. Ernst Simmel, and was forcibly institutionalized in 1930 at a sanatorium near Zurich. There, she remained for 2 years, separated from her children, subjected to early psychiatric interventions, including Freudian analysis and sedation. She was told she had sexual repression, religious delusions, and unresolved trauma. Whether these were accurate assessments or the fashionable theories of the time remains debated. What is clearer is that her stay in the institution was deeply traumatic, not just for Alice, but for her family, who said little and did less. When she was released, she emerged changed. She separated permanently from her husband, adopted the garb of a nun, and later founded a religious nursing order in Athens. During World War II, she sheltered Jewish refugees from the Nazis. Quiet act of courage that would earn her posthumous recognition as righteous among the nations. But throughout all this, the British royal family remained publicly distant. Her name was rarely mentioned, her illness even less so. When she attended Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953, wearing her nun's habit and standing alone in the crowd of pearl-draped aristocracy, many in the British press didn't even recognize her. She was seen as eccentric, otherworldly, another odd European relation. But those who knew her story understood she was something else entirely, a reminder that even within the most image-obsessed family in the world, some truths were too heavy to frame. And still, Alice's suffering was at least acknowledged in time. For 2 other royal women, close relatives of the Queen Mother, the same bloodline would produce a far darker kind of erasure. 2 sisters, born into titles, locked away from view, declared dead while still alive. 24. Queen Mary. Bloody Mary. Her name evokes fire, quite literally. Queen Mary I of England is remembered less for her rule and more for her burnings. The first child of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, she was the daughter of a king who broke with the Pope and a mother who never stopped praying for Rome. She was born into a court of turbulence and redefined by its rejections. But behind the religious controversy and the historical branding of Bloody Mary lay a quieter mystery. Not about the people she condemned, but about the children she never had, or thought she did. Mary's story is not one of diagnosed disability, but of a mystery that still eludes medical explanation. A woman who may have suffered from an undiagnosed condition that shaped not only her personal life, but the entire future of the monarchy. She ascended the throne in 1553 at the age of 37, already considered old for marriage, and under tremendous pressure to produce an heir. For Mary, legitimacy didn't just mean political survival, it meant divine validation. She had watched her mother be cast aside, her own title stripped, and her succession questioned for decades. An heir wasn't just a child. It was proof that she, not Elizabeth, had God's blessing. So when she married Philip of Spain in 1554, expectations rose like incense. The marriage was political, but Mary seems to have genuinely loved her husband, perhaps too much. Their union was tense, symbolic, and frequently distant, as Philip spent more time abroad than in Mary's company. Still, in 1555, Mary announced she was pregnant. Her stomach had begun to swell. Her menstrual cycles had stopped. She withdrew from public life and prepared a nursery. Foreign ambassadors reported the impending birth as fact. A cradle was ordered. Prayers were issued. The court held its breath, but the child never came. Mary's abdomen began to recede. Her health weakened. The royal doctors, unsure how to respond, mumbled theories about miscalculation. Eventually, the announcement of the birth was quietly withdrawn. And then, 2 years later, it happened again. A second pregnancy, complete with reported symptoms, seclusion, and royal excitement, ended the same way, in silence. No child, no heir, no explanation. Today, many historians believe Mary suffered from phantom pregnancies, or pseudocyesis, a condition in which a woman's body mimics the signs of pregnancy, including nausea, swelling, and hormonal shifts without an actual fetus. The cause is still debated. Some argue it's psychological, triggered by overwhelming stress or desire. Others suggest it may be related to ovarian cysts, uterine tumors, or hormonal imbalances. In Mary's case, there are also theories of endocrine disorders, or even early-onset uterine cancer, which may have contributed to her death in 1558. But no single answer fully explains the repeated symptoms, or the royal court's desperate willingness to believe them. What is clear is that these false pregnancies crushed Mary. The loss of imagined children, not once, but twice, was more than personal tragedy. It was dynastic failure. Without an heir, the Tudor line would pass to her half-sister Elizabeth, a Protestant, undoing the religious reversals Mary had fought so violently to achieve. And while history would immortalize her as a tyrant, the woman behind the crown spent her final years in illness, humiliation, and bitter disappointment, not just in politics, but in her own body. She had ruled a kingdom, but could not rule the silence inside her womb. Yet Mary's case would not be the last of Tudor-era medical enigmas, because her own niece, born into a generation just one step removed from her father's iron rule, would show signs of affliction not in her belly, but in her blood, her brain, and the tremors that came without warning. A child whose seizures would raise questions no one dared answer aloud. 25. King Henry VII. The founder of the Tudor dynasty knew better than most that power was borrowed, never guaranteed. King Henry VII, who took the crown at Bosworth Field in 1485, was a man of strategy rather than spectacle, cautious, calculating, and constantly watching for the next rebellion. He united the red and white roses with his marriage to Elizabeth of York, ending the Wars of the Roses not with a grand gesture, but with quiet political threading. But while the union brought peace to England's battle-weary nobles, it also gave rise to children who bore more than royal blood. One of them may have carried an unspoken legacy, one that shook beneath silks and coronets, and whispered of fragility in a world built on strength. Her name was Mary Tudor, not to be confused with her more famous niece, Queen Mary I. This Mary, the youngest daughter of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, was born in 1496 and quickly became a prized piece in her father's diplomatic chessboard. At 16, she was married off to Louis XII of France, a man 34 years her senior, in a political alliance meant to stabilize relations between two frequently clashing monarchies. But her story didn't stay within the clean lines of royal expectation. Mary was described in early life as beautiful, charming, and vivacious, a Tudor rose in full bloom. But as she reached adolescence, reports began to emerge that she was subject to episodes of illness that didn't always follow the usual patterns of courtly health crises. While many of her ailments were dismissed as female complaints or exhaustion from travel and childbirth, there were also mentions, in French court letters and English ambassadorial reports, of sudden fainting spells, uncontrollable shaking, and moments of disorientation. Modern historians have speculated that Mary Tudor may have suffered from epilepsy or a related seizure disorder, conditions not named or understood in the 16th century. At the time, such episodes were explained away as a weakness of the head, nerves, or falling fits. They were not seen as medical mysteries to be solved, but as conditions to be concealed, especially for a royal woman, whose political value was measured in marriageability and fertility. Following the death of Louis XII in 1515, Mary famously married Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, her brother Henry VIII's closest friend. in a union that was both romantic and politically reckless. Though initially furious, Henry eventually forgave them. Mary returned to England, where she lived in relative quiet, raising her children and retreating from public life. Her health, however, continued to decline. Records from the 1520s describe her as often unwell, prone to weakness, and burdened with sudden spells. She died in 1533 at just 37 years old, the same year her brother Henry was declaring Anne Boleyn queen and severing ties with Rome. Amid the noise of dynastic rupture, Mary's quiet death drew little attention. But her symptoms, the tremors, the collapses, the unpredictable surges of illness, leave behind a portrait of someone who, in today's terms, may well have lived with a neurological disorder. And unlike her niece, Queen Mary I, whose public failures were written in flames, Mary Tudor faded in private, her ailments chalked up to the vague language of delicate health. Still, the pattern deepens. A line of women, royal, protected, and yet strangely vulnerable, each marked by invisible forces that twisted their fates away from the narrative the crown demanded. And next comes a king whose daughters would live on the political edge, one of whom would bear a child whose silence, from the moment of birth, would signal a different kind of inheritance, one not of power, but of absence. 26. King Edward IV. He was not supposed to be king, and yet he ruled with the swagger of someone born to it. Edward IV was tall, charismatic, and unnervingly competent in a century defined by bloodshed and betrayal. As the first Yorkist king to seize the English throne during the Wars of the Roses, he held power by balancing brutality with charm, a monarch who could win battles and banquets with equal skill. But behind the battlefield bravado and courtly glamour was the same shadow that had loomed over Plantagenet blood for generations, a legacy of children who bore burdens no one would speak about directly. One of Edward's daughters, likely born out of wedlock, was said to live a life so far from courtly expectation that chroniclers simply referred to her as mute and frail. Her name, if it was recorded at all, has been buried under centuries of clerical shorthand and royal redactions. But the existence of such a daughter appears in a handful of contemporary accounts, not in the polished histories of Edward's reign, but in letters and domestic records, many of which describe a girl raised quietly on the periphery of noble life, possibly under the care of a monastic household. She is never listed among Edward's recognized bastards, of which there were several, nor among the legitimate daughters he had with Elizabeth Woodville. Instead, she lingers in the margins, described only in passing, a girl of sickly disposition who spoke not and was subject to fits of weeping. In another document, a servant writes of the mute child of the king, kept at prayer in the house of sisters, most likely referring to a convent or a noble house under ecclesiastical supervision. At the time, mute did not necessarily mean the complete absence of speech. It could mean delayed language, limited verbal expression, or communication deemed unintelligible or socially unacceptable. The description of her as frail suggests either physical disability or extreme vulnerability to illness, or both. In an age when disability had no medical framework and every behavior was interpreted through moral or religious lenses, children like her were neither diagnosed nor studied. They were sequestered, protected perhaps, but hidden. What we can gather from the fragments is that this daughter lived far from court, never married, and was likely raised in spiritual seclusion. The language used to describe her mirrors what appears across medieval accounts of those with intellectual or developmental disabilities: blessed, innocent, touched. Words that soften the truth while reinforcing the sense that these children were not quite of the world they were born into. Edward IV himself, for all his appetite for grandeur, seems to have made no public acknowledgement of this daughter, but the quiet arrangements for her care, the indirect financial records, the attached stewards, suggest that she was not abandoned, only edited. For kings, concealment was a form of protection. Or at least, That's what they told themselves. This daughter's story, like so many others, disappears into the fog of history without resolution. But her silence speaks to a larger pattern of royal children who, by virtue of their fragility, became ghosts in their own family trees. And that ghost would return again, in the next generation, not in the body of a lost daughter, but in a prince whose tics, stammers, and uncontrollable gestures would make courtiers wince, and historians wonder whether the crown itself had started to tremble. 27. Prince George Augustus, future King George II. He would one day be King of Great Britain and Ireland, but as a child, Prince George Augustus was not born into certainty, nor was he born into English soil. The future George II entered the world in 1683 in Hanover, part of the Holy Roman Empire, a small German state with big ambitions. He was the son of the Elector of Hanover and Sophia of the Palatinate, a granddaughter of James III of England, and by an accident of dynastic chaos and strategic Protestantism, he would become Britain's second Hanoverian monarch. But before he wore a crown, before he spoke in Parliament, he had to learn how to speak at all. And that did not come easily. Court records and private letters from the Hanoverian household make frequent mention of George's childhood difficulties, not the kind that scandalize, but the kind that quietly worry everyone in the room. He was described as a nervous child, prone to pacing and repetitive behaviors, with a severe stammer that plagued him well into adulthood. According to family accounts, young George struggled with verbal communication, often getting stuck mid-sentence or repeating syllables until prompted or redirected by an adult. Some even noted strange tics, including hand gestures and throat noises that appeared involuntary, signs that today might be interpreted as part of a neurological or developmental condition, but at the time were treated with embarrassment, or more often, simply ignored. His tutors wrote cautiously of a boy, eager to please but easily overwhelmed, slow to grasp spoken instructions, and frequently agitated in new settings. When formal education began, George was reportedly intelligent in written subjects, especially history and military theory, but continued to lag in oral performance. The anxiety around public speaking became so intense that, according to one account, he would fall physically ill before being asked to recite anything before others. In the tightly wound world of German princely courts, this was not just a personal inconvenience, it was a reputational problem. Princes were expected to command attention, lead ceremonies, give orders. A child who could not speak fluently, or who appeared nervous in court, risked being viewed as weak, unfit, or worse, defective. Sophia of Hanover, his sharp-witted mother, was reportedly both protective and privately exasperated, noting in one letter that her son was a fine boy if only his mouth would listen to his brain. When George arrived in England in 1714, following the death of Queen Anne and the installation of his father, George III, the cultural challenges were compounded. He still spoke with a heavy accent, his English halting and rehearsed, his stammer worsened under pressure. British courtiers, already suspicious of their new German rulers, noted how uncomfortable George seemed in public settings, how stiffly he moved, and how difficult it was to hold conversation with him unless it was written down first. As king, George II would eventually gain a reputation for being short-tempered, abrupt, and emotionally distant. Traits often interpreted as rudeness, but perhaps more accurately viewed as defensive habits, developed over a lifetime of struggling to communicate effectively. In private, he was said to be anxious and rigid about schedule, with bursts of energy followed by prolonged silences. His early speech difficulties were rarely discussed once he became king. Like so many aspects of royal vulnerability, they were retroactively edited out of the official portrait, but the echoes remained, in his clipped speeches, in his strained public appearances, and in the discomfort he seemed to carry around his own voice. And those echoes, too, would continue, because the next royal remembered for physical difference wouldn't just stammer, he would walk crooked, breathe unevenly, and become one of the most contested figures in English history. a king whose body defied royal idealism, and whose bloodline would carry forward yet another trace of something too complicated to name. 28. King Richard III. He is one of the most infamous monarchs in English history, a figure whose reputation has been twisted by propaganda, theatrical villainy, and centuries of selective memory. King Richard III has long stood as a symbol of dynastic cruelty and ambition, thanks in part to Shakespeare's dramatized portrait of a scheming, power-hungry usurper with a twisted spine and a darker soul. But behind the myth, behind the Tudor smear campaigns and the skeleton under the Leicester car park, there remains the complicated truth of a royal body that was, by all historical and medical evidence, physically different, and of a child who may have inherited more than just his father's ill-fated name. Richard III was born in 1452 into the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. He rose to power not because he was destined for it, but because enough people around him died, disappeared, or were pushed aside. His reign was brief, just 2 years, and ended on the battlefield at Bosworth in 1485. For centuries, historians debated the physical descriptions of Richard, wondering how much of his so-called crookedness was real and how much was Tudor invention. But in 2012, when his remains were discovered beneath a parking lot in Leicester, the answer became clear. Richard had scoliosis, a sideways curvature of the spine that would have been visible in life, especially during adolescence and adulthood. He was not a hunchback. He was not deformed in the grotesque way his enemies portrayed him. But he did have a physical condition that would have affected his posture, stamina, and perhaps most importantly, how he was perceived in a world where the king's body was expected to reflect divine perfection. But Richard's story doesn't end with his own skeleton. It threads forward into his illegitimate children, especially his son John of Gloucester, who is sometimes referred to as John of Pontefract, or simply the Bastard of Gloucester. John's exact birth date is unknown, but he was likely born in the 1470s and acknowledged by Richard during his time as Duke of Gloucester. Unlike Richard's other illegitimate child, Catherine Plantagenet, John was given titles and responsibilities. Most notably, he was appointed Captain of Calais, a military role of real consequence. Yet even with this recognition, John's life remains mysterious. Contemporary descriptions of him are limited, but some chroniclers note that he was weakly in health, a phrase often used to describe someone prone to illness or physical limitation. There is no direct evidence that John had scoliosis like his father, but given the heritable nature of many spinal and musculoskeletal conditions, it is possible, if not probable, that he inherited some form of physical frailty. There are also hints that he may have struggled with legitimacy in more than just legal terms. He never married, had no known children, and faded from political life quickly after Richard's death. By 1499 he had vanished from the record altogether, possibly imprisoned, possibly executed on Henry VII's orders. His story, like so many others touched by disability and illegitimacy in royal circles, was not preserved. It was quietly erased. What remains, however, is the unsettling pattern. A king whose body defied royal expectations, and a son whose life vanished in silence. The Plantagenets, so obsessed with bloodlines and image, had once again produced a child who could not carry the weight of either. But this was hardly unique. Because the woman who followed Richard, a monarch with no children of her own, would inherit his ghosts in a different form. And though she bore no heirs, her court was full of royal wards whose minds and manners often strayed from courtly norms, and who were kept just far enough from the throne to avoid questions no one wanted to answer. 29. Queen Elizabeth I. She was the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the monarch who turned celibacy into statecraft and ruled alone in a world that expected her to marry. Queen Elizabeth I mastered the art of political performance, veiled threats in sonnets, diplomacy in pearls, and speeches that could shake an army into obedience. But beneath the mythos of empire and eternal youth was a court system filled with orphans, wards, and inconveniently placed cousins. Many of them descended from royal blood, and some of them not quite right, by the standards of the time. Elizabeth ruled for 45 years but bore no children. This did not mean, however, that she presided over a childless court. As queen, she inherited a network of noble families whose offspring were often placed under royal supervision. These were the sons and daughters of executed traitors, distant Plantagenet cousins, or nobles too politically sensitive to raise their children unsupervised. Elizabeth gathered them under her wing, at court, in foster homes loyal to the crown, or in specially managed households. Among these children were names the monarchy would later erase, or at least marginalize, because of what they represented, a different kind of inheritance. Historians have long noted the presence of royal wards described as simple, slow, or unfit during Elizabeth's reign. These labels were not medical diagnoses, there were none, but polite court euphemisms for what we would now recognize as developmental disabilities or cognitive delays. The most notable cases involved descendants of the Grey and Pole families, both of whom had claims to the throne, however distant, and therefore required monitoring. Many of these children were taken into royal custody not because they were threats, but because they were embarrassments. Too close to power, but not functional enough to participate in it. One such child was Arthur Grey, a descendant of Lady Jane Grey's uncle. Contemporary letters from court officials describe him as gentle but dull, oft distracted, and best kept from counsel. Another was Mary Hastings, a distant Plantagenet who, according to foreign ambassadors, was considered by some as a dynastic backup during succession debates. Yet reports from the Russian ambassador describe her as not well-spoken and uncertain in gaze, adding that she spoke little and not always clearly. Whether this was due to anxiety, a speech impediment, or a deeper cognitive issue is unclear, but it was enough to keep her far from serious consideration. These royal wards were often raised in quiet country estates under the supervision of trusted nobility. They were not imprisoned, but they were managed. Some never married. Some lived out their lives as ceremonial figures, wheeled out for family events, and then returned to obscurity. Their portraits, if they exist, show them dressed like everyone else but somehow apart. Eyes looking just slightly off, posture stiff, expression unfixed. Elizabeth herself seemed aware of their presence, and likely saw their condition as part of the burden of blood, proof that divine right came with mortal flaws. She once referred, obliquely, to those whose minds are gentle though not sharp, a phrase that may have been about one such child under her protection. She did not parade them nor punish them. She simply kept them close and quiet, and though she died without an heir, the ghost of her lineage lived on, not through sons or daughters, but through these forgotten fragments of dynastic responsibility, because the next generation would inherit more than the throne. They would inherit the question of what to do with royal blood that failed to meet the crown's impossible expectations. A question that would surface again in the next royal household, when a princess gave birth across the sea, and the consequences of her marriage brought not only revolution but the reappearance of the same old afflictions, now wrapped in orange and blue. 30. King Charles I. He was a king who could not compromise, ruling a country that had stopped asking politely. Charles I, son of James I and father of civil war, remains one of the most tragic figures in British monarchy, not for the wars he started, but for the execution he could not escape. He believed in kingship the way others believe in gravity. It was self-evident, God-ordained, and immune to negotiation. That belief, unbending to the last, would cost him his head in 1649. But before the axe, before the war, before the divine right met mortal resistance, Charles had a family, a large one, scattered across Europe by marriage, diplomacy, and the chaos of regicide. One of his children, Mary, Princess Royal, would go on to carry the Stuart blood into Dutch soil. And through her, a lesser-known tragedy unfolded. Not political this time, but personal. A story of children who bore royal names, but not royal strength, and who reminded everyone involved that even divine bloodlines are not immune to the quiet erosion of fragility. Mary was Charles's eldest daughter, born in 1631 into the luxuries and rituals of Stuart royalty. She was bright, poised, and politically useful. At just 9 years old, she was betrothed to William II of Orange, heir to one of the wealthiest and most powerful provinces in the Dutch Republic. The marriage took place when she was only 15, a union of Protestant allies in the face of rising European tensions. And while Mary adapted quickly to Dutch court life, the marriage was brief and punctuated by grief. William died of smallpox in 1650, leaving Mary widowed at 19 and pregnant with their only child. That child was William III of Orange, future King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. But before he rose to power during the Glorious Revolution, his early life was marked by illness and frailty. Born prematurely, he was considered delicate from the start. He suffered chronic respiratory issues, likely asthma, and persistent infections that led physicians to fear for his survival well into childhood. There are records of seizures, fevers, and extended periods of weakness, with Dutch and English envoys alike commenting on his poor constitution. It didn't end there. William's own childless marriage to Mary II, his first cousin and the daughter of James II, produced no heirs, another dynastic dead end. Some accounts suggest that he suffered not just from physical ailments but also from psychosomatic symptoms, likely brought on by his lifelong health struggles and rigid upbringing. But even more telling is what happened to Mary's other children, or rather, the children she never got to raise. Because before William III, Mary gave birth to at least one other child, possibly more, who died in infancy. One was said to have been born with visible congenital defects, noted vaguely in letters by attending physicians and religious officials as not viable or touched by God's mysterious will. No names were recorded, no portraits were painted. They disappeared from the record before they ever appeared in public life. This wasn't unusual. In early modern Europe, royal infants who showed signs of severe disability or illness were often baptized quickly and quietly buried, sometimes with no official documentation at all. But for Mary, who had grown up watching her own father unravel in the face of political collapse, and who had seen half her siblings die young or fade into exile, the loss carried a heavier weight. She had married into strength and buried it. She had borne a line meant to unify Protestant Europe and watched it thin, flicker, and nearly vanish. And so the Stuart legacy limped onward, not in triumph but in compromise, ill health, and silence. Because disability in royal history is rarely treated as part of the narrative. It is treated as a pause, an error, a footnote, a complication best covered by ceremony and forgotten as quickly as possible. But the forgetting never quite works. Because these children, lost, silenced, erased, still shape the stories we tell about power, perfection, and inheritance. And the cycle would begin again, not with princes this time, but with queens, one of whom would wear the crown as if it were armor, while her son disappeared behind the garden walls of Sandringham.